Going live very shortly. Okay. Good evening to those in Australia and good morning to those into the US. This is USI of ACT in our very first broadcast over this medium. For those members out there, you're well aware that we normally would have a softening up process at the bar at the mess prior to our guest speaking schedule commencing. Unfortunately, the virus is precluding us from doing that, and we've now decided to initiate other options. And we're very fortunate this evening to have two speakers with us, one from the USA and one who you know very well in Major General Marcus Thompson, to speak to the membership tonight around cyber and information warfare. And I will be moderating the evening. Our two guests tonight have considerable background in information-related capabilities, tightening the references up to information warfare, information operations. A lot of lexicon will be swirling around, and hopefully they can demystify that for us this evening. The way that the evening will run is that I will moderate. I will ask a question. Each of the speakers have seen a list of these questions, and I'll ask one to comment on that topic. I'll ask the next speaker to respond. If that generates a life of its own, we'll keep that going, and I'll move through a list of questions. I'll be alternating the lead off from Marcus to John to comment. And after about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, hopefully many of you will have mastered your Twitter accounts or email, and we'll have some questions that have been generated from the presentations to that time. We're looking to run no more than an hour, which is our usual format, and I'll be in the middle crisis managing anything that that pops up. So firstly, we have from Australia and currently serving in Defence, Major General Marcus Thompson, known to many of you. He was our last speaker face to face. He's now graciously agreed to come back on and present again tonight, but we hope with a bit of a difference, bouncing his views and experience off those of another very experienced practitioner and military professional in Major General Davies. So we hope it will value add and contribute and build on what we've already seen and been very fortunate to receive from Major General Thompson. So I'm not going to spend too much time on his bio. It's also with great pleasure to welcome Major General retired John Davies, US Army, who is now working with Palo Alto Networks. He's been out of the service for 4 to 5 years, and it's great that he's able to contribute his great expertise in this area in other ways beyond military service. Palo Alto, as you see from the flyers, is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, cybersecurity company in the world, securing networks and information across thousands, tens of thousands of companies in 150 countries. And importantly, it's not just the business area. He's still involved with provision of services to government and defence sectors. So I'd briefly like Marcus to just fill in where you've been and what you've been doing since your last presentation. Then I'll hand over to John to give us a bit more detail on who you are, where you've been, and why we should spend time with you this evening. So Marcus.
Yeah, sure thing, Bill, and good evening to you. I just want to say up front, just wanted to commend USI for pulling this event together as attendees at the face-to-face session that we had immediately before the COVID-19 outbreak would recall. I mean, I've been posing the question of how do we have sensible public discussions on this topic for some time, and I certainly commend you, Bill, and the team there at USI for pulling this together and continuing that conversation during these challenging times. And it's a great pleasure and indeed an honour to have the opportunity to be working with John this evening. What have I been doing since we last spoke in February? Well, where have I been? Well, I've been in Canberra because there's not too much travelling going on for any of us, and we've just been getting on with doing what we do here within Information Warfare Division during these challenging times. And of course, our role here within the division is as the capability manager for Australian Defence Force capability in cyber, in electronic warfare, in information operations, in command and control, and in what we've called space services, which is loosely satellite communications and assured position navigation and timing. So that's been my role now for over 3 years. In fact, over 3.5 years, Bill. So not much more to add to that.
Thanks very much, Marcus. John.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's an honor to join you and Marcus today for a great topic of discussion. And I'd also like to thank USI for all their hard work in putting this together. I joined Palo Alto Networks almost 5 years ago as Chief Security Officer for the federal sector. And last December, transitioned into my current role as Vice President of the public sector at Palo Alto Networks. And this was after 35 years in the US military. Now, most of my career was as, in airborne, ranger, infantry, and special operations assignments. But the last decade of my service was all cyber-related assignments. So assignments in cyber operations, cyber policy and strategy, US interagency cyber coordination, international cyber cooperation, and some interaction with the US Defense Industrial Base. That military career included directing information warfare at the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, and SOCOM, a US Special Operations Command. It included commanding the Army's only active information warfare brigade. I helped stand up US Cyber Command and was her first director of current operations. So in that role, I directed the operations and defense of DoD's information networks, which is at the time was approximately 15,000 network enclaves in 88 countries with approximately 5 million user accounts and 7 million IT devices, and directed offensive operations when authorized. I retired as the first senior military cyber advisor at the Pentagon, and simultaneously was appointed as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy the last 18 months before I retired, which I think, Bill, is where I met you. Today, I just hope to share my personal perspective on the topic based on my 4 decades of experience in both the public and private sectors.
Thanks very much, John. And that's quite a CV, and we're very honored to be able to seek your contribution to the discussion. And these kind of discussions are very important as we try and get our heads around what is conceptually difficult, and even more difficult when it comes to how it's integrated into daily life as well as military life. So again, after you sorted out everything in Army, I'm sure that was a job that was quickly achieved. You certainly seem to have your mind all over it when I did the advanced course down there in Alabama, and came out of that a whole lot more appreciative of the task ahead. So hopefully we can demystify that tonight. Thank you very much for those brief intros. And I'll lead off with the first topic, and Marcus is aware of what I'm going to talk about here. But as we're all aware, with cyber in the information warfare realm is foremost in people's minds recently in Australia. We've suffered an attack across government, business, and the country from a sophisticated actor. No names, no pack drill, lots of conjecture, but serious disruption and very annoying. So for you, Marcus, the first question is, are cyber and information warfare the same thing? And is it important for the non-specialists to know this? So the people on this line and those not directly associated, why should we make the distinction?
Well, so Bill, I describe information warfare If you picture three concentric circles, information warfare being a piece of cyber, a piece of electronic warfare as we traditionally know it, and the third concentric circle being, or the third intersecting circle in the Venn diagram being information operations. And I think that electronic warfare, we've had military capabilities in that area for some time. Information operations, well, they've been around since biblical times. And of course, the relatively new kid on the block is cyber. Now, of course, across the Five Eyes, we've recognised cyberspace as a warfighting domain, and in an Australian sense, we've nuanced that a little bit to describe that fifth domain as information and cyber, or cyber and information. I would just say, though, I mean, we can wrap ourselves around the axles about all of this sort of stuff, but I have a strongly held view that there's actually nothing much new in cyber warfare or in cyberspace. Full stop. Attack is still attack. Defense is still defense. Theft is still theft. Espionage is still espionage. What's relatively new, of course, is the conduct of those activities in cyberspace, and that's why generalists or non-specialists need to understand this as a warfighting domain, and the opportunities that presents, and also the threats and the vulnerabilities that exist in threats to force in that warfighting domain. I might just say up front that when we say cyber and information warfare, I'm always really quick to point out the difference between war and warfare. So war, a legally defined, internationally accepted state of affairs. Warfare, being the conduct of those activities. And of course, with just earlier this month, the Australian government released its Defence Strategic Update, and there were references to grey zone activity, where we start to see some of these activities happening in what we used to call operations short of war, but now we talk about grey zone activity, and that's why it's important for people who are thinking about these things to be on the ball.
Thanks, Marcus. I'll hand over now to you, John, if you want to pick up that thread.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. It's a great question. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that I'm going to disagree with what Marcus said. So maybe I can dive a little bit deeper into that. While I think it's important to be precise in terminology, in my own personal experience, I think that sometimes we confuse ourselves with terminology. And I've been embroiled in my share of what I'll call term warfare over the years. Unfortunately, sometimes the preferred terminology from one group or position is tied up in resource and budgetary decisions. So it's more about, the win-lose dynamic outcomes for people, money, and capabilities more than a conceptual or doctrinal purity. In fact, there was a huge war in the US military back in the 1995 to 1998 period over the term information warfare versus information operations. I'm personally an advocate of information warfare because that term warfare scares a lot of people, but as Marcus said, war is different from warfare. So I know we'll get into that later. I'll just tell you how I was educated based on my personal journey and why I think there is a distinction between the two. But I realize there are just plain different views about the terminology. Some countries believe that cyber is everything to do with information warfare, and all of the other information related capabilities like psychological operations, electronic warfare, deception, public affairs, etc. They're just categories underneath this giant term cyber. Others, like me, believe that information warfare is the overarching term, and cyber is but one of those capabilities that can contribute to IW, as are all the others. My understanding goes back to my upbringing as a young infantry officer in the 80s, and the US military had this thing called combined arms. So I was in the infantry branch, and the Army had other branches: armor, field artillery, engineer, military intelligence, signal and communications, all special skills that are required, but you had to think combined arms. And that was the motto in every branch school, because you were never going to fight as anything other than a combined arms team with all the other branches. I mean, even at an infantry platoon level, I had a forward observer for integration with the field artillery. At the company level, you had artillery, intel, signal, sometimes armor and engineer complements. Battalions operated as a task force with their slice of all the other required branches. Planning and operations all focused on this approach to land warfare, and I don't think it's any different with information warfare. Only the branches are now cyber, electronic warfare, psychological operations, deception, operation security, sometimes space, sometimes strategic communications and public affairs, etc. Each individual information-related capability is important for its own skills, planning capabilities, and organizational structure. But to be effectively employed, they must be integrated to operate together, to reinforce and support the other information-related capabilities in very innovative and powerful ways, like cyber-enabled electronic warfare and vice versa, electronic warfare-enabled cyber, or cyber-delivered psychological operations. And the key lesson I learned was that the military can't do cyber or information warfare well alone. They have to integrate with other government agencies, partners and allies, and even industry to be effective in the modern information age. So for me, cyber is to EW as infantry is to combined arms land warfare. And to progress as a leader in the military, you had to learn how to effectively employ the other branches in an integrated fashion. Cyber is to IW as the Army is to joint military warfare. And to progress as a leader in the Army, you have to learn how to effectively employ the Navy, Marines, and Air Force in the joint environment. And by the way, that's the only way you get to be a general, is there's a requirement for joint education and experience. It's no different for the information environment if you want to effectively influence human decision-making and behavior in the digital age.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Marcus is busily putting that all together in coherent doctrine so that we march off as one joint and integrated force, and he'll be very happy with his journey.
Well, Bill, we might have to start keeping a tally of how many times John and I say this evening that, or this morning for John, I agree with, because I could not agree more strongly. I mean, we've been on this journey for some time, and we know that cyber effects in and of themselves are unlikely to be decisive in a conflict. Those cyber effects, those information effects, will be at their very, very best when they are fully integrated with other effects, both kinetic and non-kinetic.
And just a quick reference to the course that I attended, overseen by John. One of the prime aims was to understand how best to integrate centuries of knowledge in integration of physical or force-related capabilities, kinetic effects, with this brave new world, an appreciation of what it could do, the tools that it's bringing to the fore. How do we get that integrated across our commands and joint forces so that our commanders are aware when they make their decisions of options that otherwise would not have been there, that may be far more advantageous in effect and consequences than otherwise would be. So there is a journey for our Defence Force in not just understanding the landscape and nailing down what we're talking about, but how it relates to the profession of arms as we knew it before ones and zeros entered the fight. So I'd like to move on to the next question there, John, and you can lead off on that one. It's a little bit broader and it takes us beyond the military, but do you think that nation states will continue to play the dominant role in shaping global cybersecurity environment in the near future? And if not, which non-state actors do you believe may play a dominant role and why? So at the moment, the assumption is this is a big boys game, it's governments, but there are other non-state actors out there, both good and bad. What's your view on their influence in this landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think it will increasingly be both. So let me describe what I've been seeing for the past decade or so. It starts with an understanding that, the difficulty in attributing cyber operations publicly, I think, will continue to play a role in adversary decision-making and the use of cyber as a tool to pursue their national interests. However, the ability for adversaries to hide their operations is not nearly as easy as it used to be, since the US and its partners and allies' cyber-related intelligence capabilities, they've greatly improved attribution over the past decade. And sometimes that's been reinforced by a growing global industry cyber threat intelligence capability and various public-private partnerships for cyber threat intelligence sharing that I've been involved in since I've retired. I think the use of the intelligence element of national power to expose adversary cyber operations can be an effective deterrent, not always, but can be, or have a powerful negative impact on subsequent adversary operations. However, in my experience, the effective use of this element of power most often combined with the use of other elements of national, international, and industry power and actions. The dynamic of this improved attribution and the willingness to use it through public or private exposure has already caused countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea to employ a variety of loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations, like criminal organizations, surrogates, patriotic hackers, moonlighters, research organizations. They use these in order to assist in complicating direct attribution. It's also been more recently, it's caused an increase in the use of emerging technology for offensive purposes. And there's a long list of them, like deep fakes, deep master prints, deep voice, read fakes, false flags. The list continues to grow. I think we're very likely to see the increased use of these loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations over the next, at least the foreseeable future. That is, unless we gain some international consensus for a norm against this type of irresponsible and reckless behavior, and then aggressively police the violation of this norm. And that's important. To police it is important because these loosely controlled third parties that are doing the bidding of adversary nations, whether by state direction, which is sometimes the case in the criminal organizations or surrogates, or simply by state inspiration, as in the case of patriotic hackers, this creates great uncertainty and instability. These third parties are likely to have questionable motivations and skills. They're unaccountable for their actions. And as a result, their actions are more likely to lead to mistakes and escalation from the virtual environment into the physical world. I think every responsible nation in the world has an interest in banning the use of these loosely controlled cyber third parties. And it should be no different than what we've done to come together in the case against loose nukes and non-proliferation or piracy or child pornography or terrorism. I think it's important to continue to employ all the appropriate levers of power to both publicly reveal these third parties, as well as ensure that there are negative consequences for their actions.
Thanks, John. Marcus, I'll ask you to respond.
I'm not sure I can improve on John's comments. I'd just say that it's fascinating, isn't it? How quickly this conversation has changed out of the global CT fight back into great power competition, and just what that has meant in the context of this question. I would just say that, and just a reminder that cyber response is but one response option open to government, and so we don't need to be too wrapped around the axles about that. But in terms of perhaps a non-state actor that we haven't talked about yet is the role here of industry. I mean, when we think through the fact that the majority of cyberspace as a physical domain of cables and computers and servers and whatnot connected around the world, the vast majority of it is privately owned. And so, what does that mean in terms of the role of government, the freedom of action of government in Western democracies, to operate in that environment, in that terrain that is predominantly privately owned?
Great, thanks. John, anything more to add on that before we move on?
No, I think that, Marcus he is exceptionally right about the role of industry as a non-state actor. But for me, that's why it's so important. These cooperative efforts between government and industry are so important in this domain.
Thanks. Marcus, we'll move on to another question here. I think this was the Dorothy Dixer that John was anticipating. Are we at war in cyberspace 24/7? What are the key drivers that USS will impact the nation's willingness to use offensive cyber operations over the next few years in that context?
Well, I think we've already addressed parts of that. I mean, I made the observation, or I made the distinction between war and warfare. War being that legally defined, internationally accepted state of affairs. So I mean, definitions of war, honestly, Bill, I will leave that to lawyers and to policy colleagues to argue the hell out of that. Are there warfare techniques being used on a daily basis? Yes, there are. And are they being used by state actors, non-state actors, criminal groups, hobbyists? All of that is evident. I mean, I made the point earlier. There's nothing much new here. Attack is still attack, defense is still defense, theft is still theft, espionage is still espionage. But what's new is it's all happening in this relatively new domain of cyberspace. I mean, you ask about the offensive capability, and since Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull declared our offensive capability in 2016, April 2016, resident within the Australian Signals Directorate and used in support of military operations. That's all part of Australia recognising cyberspace as a warfighting domain. I would just say that I see that remaining the exclusive domain of government, certainly within liberal Western democracies, for the absolutely foreseeable future. I mean, every now and then, I'll have someone ask me about, someone from industry or from a big company say, who's the subject of routine, regular, scaled cyber attack. We should be able to hack back. Well, that's one that would be illegal in a court, by my understanding of Australia's domestic law. But also, and perhaps more importantly, we don't need vigilantes out doing this sort of stuff. John talked about some of the challenges of attribution. They are absolutely real. It's a little bit different for government because governments have all of these intelligence capabilities, intelligence agencies that can all combine to support an assessment, an intelligence assessment of the origins of any activity. My sense is that my strong belief is that the offensive capability remains the sole domain of government. Even then, it's going to be incredibly tightly controlled for all the right reasons.
Good. I think we can maybe tease the pros and cons and the context at which it may be employed. I'm sure people are interested in that, but I'd like to get John's views now on the question, and maybe we can tease out a few more threads, particularly around the offensive side, which in Australia has been largely not acknowledged. Now it's in the open sphere, and very much like other narratives, getting a quite clear understanding of what it is and how it may be used legally, I think, is important before the narrative gets too high and to the right and people get too excited about what we are now considering as part of another arrow in the quiver of information warfare capabilities. John.
Yeah, Bill, it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the discussions that we have today, at least in the US, it's just super interesting. We can talk about things today, and especially as a retired general, I have a little bit more leeway than my brothers and sisters in uniform, but not much, but a little bit. some of the things we used to talk about when I was at Cyber Command that we would never be able to talk about them today as openly as we do. And I think there's been a very large effort by the US military and many of its partners to become more transparent about what the military is doing in cyber. I think that is important. I think it's good. You know, cyber has long lived in the darkness and anonymity of the world of espionage and criminal activity. And when you start getting the uniformed military involved in it, I think it deserves more transparency. Certainly not total transparency. You don't want to give away advantages, but I think it's an appropriate trend that has been happening. On the topic, on the question, for me, in my experience, war is ultimately a political decision. And it's usually based on an assessment that some other nation or nations have done something to your country and or your allies that result in a political decision that whatever has been done constitutes an act of armed aggression or a hostile act in accordance with the international humanitarian law of armed conflict. And that's where the legal part comes in. But for me, it's a political decision where national leadership has got to make a decision on whether or not to employ the use of military force in response. And like Marcus, I don't believe we're at war, but it's more complicated than that. You know, usually the decision to respond is based with armed response is based on an assessment that whatever has happened or is about to happen is what we called in the US policymaking arena a significant event. And that would mean, among other things, that a national and or economic, national or economic security was at stake, or maybe public safety and security is at stake, where people have lost their lives or could lose their lives on a widespread basis. So while I do not believe we're at war in those terms, like Marcus, I believe we're engaged in a type of modern warfare along the lines of economic warfare or political warfare. And if you give me just a couple of minutes, I'll expand on it, because and I'll expand on why I think this is a key driver in a nation's willingness to use offensive cyber actions. I believe that it's critical to change the overall adversary cost versus benefit risk calculation. Largely, it's been, adversary win, targets lose, whoever those targets are of the adversary. And it needs to move to adversary lose, targets win, meaning the stronger target defenses defeat adversary offense, or maybe the targets lose, but so does the adversary. And that means the target's counteraction through cyber or other national elements of power responses make it just as or even more costly for the adversary than the cost imposed on the target as a result of adversary offensive action. And we should recognize that we and our allies, we in the US and our allies, have some real advantages over our adversaries when it comes to achieving that dynamic of the adversary loses and the target wins, and as well as we both lose. And I know we've got another question coming up later, and I'll talk about how we make the adversary lose when employing offensive operations. But simply put, it's about applying modern cybersecurity innovations that I believe are available today. And in terms of the dynamic where, even though the target may suffer consequences, but the adversary will lose as well, my view is that we should be doing everything in our collective power to expose what our adversaries are doing and then respond using combinations of all available elements of national and cooperative international power. Effective and coordinated use of diplomatic, economic, law enforcement, and even military elements can impose costs on the adversary by countering the very information warfare apparatus, including cyber aspects, that is being used by the adversary to attack us. While I fully support the notion that any solid offensive cyber capability must have strong cyber defenses as a foundation, our adversaries are attacking us with increasing speed and scale using both cyber and broader information warfare operations. And as Marcus said, they are doing so deliberately below the threshold of traditional acts of war to create confusion and fear, to sow doubt, to accentuate extreme division in our population. They know that they can't defeat our military with traditional capabilities, They're using these operations to attack us in this gray zone that Mark has talked about because they have an advantage over us. And in my view, we're currently losing this battle. And a growing number of adversaries are using these techniques to help us and other democracies tear ourselves apart. And by the way, just a little tangent here. The recent impact of the deadly global pandemic accompanied with, severe economic impact and recently inflamed racial tensions on top of an already historically divided society within many Western democracies presents an historical opportunity for our adversaries to gain an advantage over those democracies. And put aside a political lens for the moment, because what I'm going to say has nothing to do with any political or cultural agenda. So I'm not taking sides here. But if you look around, truth has never been put into more doubt, while selective truth and distortion to fit extreme agendas and vastly different worldviews on both sides of the political and cultural divides has never been more powerful. I believe that, Western nations are experiencing a time of great risk to both national and international security, economic viability, public safety, and societal stability. Our adversaries know this, and they're positioning themselves to gain advantage with great urgency by using many of the techniques described as information warfare in this extremely fertile digital environment of social media. Some of my colleagues see this as a potentially existential matter for the country and our partners and allies. I don't know if it's yet, an existential problem, but I certainly believe it's a situation that our adversaries recognize as offering significant opportunities for a repositioning of advantage and relative power among nations. Influencing Western domestic publics to cause both extremist sides of cultural and political divisions to demonize each other instead of recognizing the real threat, them, by what they're doing and inflaming and magnifying these activities is an increasingly powerful tool that's empowered by today's digital age.
Thanks, John. A lot of great points there, and we don't have all night to tease them out, which we could. I think the point I would make, or the observation I'd make, is it's never been more important for leadership to bring a coherent oversight to all of these disruptions and distractions that can be enabled in the current time. And putting information capabilities like we're talking about here now into the service of that leadership, I think is critically important. And I know Marcus contributes to that. And I know that the doctrine and the approaches that you assessed in your time in the military was an attempt to bring around dealing with the cognitive side of all of these disruptions. I'd like to just quickly pull on a slightly different thread, but we've got a question in here which I think is relevant and which deals with how the international community would traditionally deal with risks and threats to stability. The question is from Daryl Shepherd on Twitter. He says, or he asks, given the criticality of information systems and danger of IW tools can produce, which you've just talked to, do you see a place for international agreements on their use in the same level as non-proliferation treaties for nuclear weapons? And we're really going, I guess, what is the efficacy of these traditional norms, treaties, agreements across the adult sphere to these kind of capabilities and in the face of these kind of disruptions we're now seeing? I think I'll ask Marcus to lead off, because I know you'll have a view, John, and you can marshal those shortly.
Should we have international norms of behaviour? Well, that would be fabulous. Are we close to getting there? My personal view is I fear not. Now, there are all sorts of UN committees, United Nations committees and organisations looking at this, and certainly the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is in there working hard to encourage the establishment of international norms and behaviours. But I think, like all of these, I mean, I don't want to speak for DFAT, But I just, again, a personal observation, I think a lot of these diplomatic matters, you know, are quite challenging to work through. And I know my colleagues at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are working very hard on that. It is a noble cause.
John.
Yeah, super interesting question. And as a matter of fact, I've been involved in, you know, since I've retired, I've been involved more in this discussion about norms than previously when in uniform. I'm not sure about the treaties. I'm not sure we're there yet, but, you know, I got a few observations for the near future that I think add some emphasis to a renewed pursuit of norms. You know, I think the absence of effective regulating global norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, it will continue to provide adversaries with significant opportunities and even encouragement for offensive cyber action. And this is in part because of the absence of negative consequences from the targeted countries or the countries they target, as has normally been the case thus far, with only a few exceptions for very limited periods of time and having limited impact on the adversary in response to their use of offensive cyber operations. I think that clearly declared and demonstrated norms of responsible behavior accompanied by an associated range of responses that are available to and demonstrated by states that are threatened by the violation of such norms could provide more of a deterrence calculus for adversary decision-making than in the past. And people often ask, how do you demonstrate something like cyber? Well, I think that there are a number of options, and they can be openly declared, covert, or clandestine examples. And I'll just give you some. One is a demonstration of capabilities. Even though a demonstration is likely to result in a, you know, use and lose consequence, there may be situations and options where the loss in the capability is worth the gain in deterrent effect, such as maybe some non-essential cyber capabilities that would eventually be exposed anyway or have already been exposed. Another might be an adverse impact to adversary capabilities with their infrastructure, their organizational structure, their research and development, their planning and decision-making processes, their even the leader and people equities without exposure of a specific capability used to achieve that impact. And whether that's related to the category of cyber or broader and more traditional response capabilities. Another example might be targeted country cyber organizational and force activity. So this is what we do in the traditional realm of, you know, training and exercises and force posturing and movement. Although if you're going to do that and you're going to expose that or demonstrate that, obviously OPSEC is an important consideration in what to reveal. And then, of course, you know, lastly, any target of an adversary, that country's use of diplomatic, economic, legal, informational, including deception, intelligence, including public exposure of adversary capabilities, organizations, infrastructure, and could even include traditional physical military levers of power. I do think, I'll just close by saying, some of the work that I've been personally involved in this idea of norms of responsible behavior, I think that there are a couple that stand out, and I've talked about one of them, and we should ban the use of those loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations. It is reckless behavior, and it is a mistake waiting to happen due to miscalculation and escalation. I also think we talked a little bit about being more transparent. I think that's a norm that should be, you know, an international norm that should be pursued. Proper oversight and accountability for cyber operations, especially in military, law enforcement, and maybe even domestic security related cyber functions. Better use of industry. I think industry needs a voice in the creation of more responsible norms, and largely this has been a government discussion. And then finally, I think cyber threat intelligence sharing between government and industry and between industry, I think is a norm that is well worth pursuing, because what it can do is it can kind of take a lot of the noise off of the radar screen so countries can more clearly see the signaling going on between countries. If you know, right now it's so confusing. If you look at cyberspace, I think by sharing cyber threat intelligence of common interest between countries, probably mostly focused on the criminal cyber threat, I think that can reduce a lot of that noise so we can more clearly see what's happening in cyberspace. So those are some norms that I've been personally advocating for in terms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace.
Thanks, John. We've got 15 minutes left, and I'm going to ask another question, and I'll lead off to Major General Thompson on this one. It's getting more to the so what do we do, and what's the best way to approach this? How do we create the information warriors we need for the challenge of future cyber competition or warfare? And should the ADF have a cyber command like the US that is another service like Army, Navy, Air Force? And I'll allow John to just think on that in terms of his experience in those journeys in the US. But Marcus, your views, thanks.
Let me, Bill, address the second question first. Should Australia have a cyber command? No. We have established and very, very effective relationships between the Australian Defence Force and the Australian Signals Directorate. It works very, very well in support of warfighters, we don't need any significant organisational change to that in Australia. Now, it's related to your first question, because quite frankly, we are at a completely different scale than the United States, and we're nowhere near as big, so penny packeting our capabilities, is all making that big delineation is counterproductive, quite frankly. We are growing our capabilities. We're growing them quickly. The Defence White Paper 2016 set us on a very aggressive path to grow our capabilities, our information warfare capabilities, and we are in fact well ahead of that aggressive timeline that government set us. It was we got a shot in the arm with the Defence Strategic Update and the Force Structure Plan that was released earlier this month, with again a significant investment in capabilities within the information and cyber domain across the defence portfolio. Exciting times for those of us working in the domain. Where are we going to find the people? Well, I tell you right now, I'm not having any trouble attracting people to the capability. If I can give you an example, one particular course that I have running at the moment, there were 60 places on that course, and there were over 1,000 expressions of interest from across the Australian Defence Force for those 60 places, and across the Defence Force, across the three services, different trades, different rank levels, having absolutely no trouble attracting people to the capability. I think I might have mentioned when we were together earlier in the year, but we had a significant event last year where the Defence Force Remuneration Tribunal that sets all of our, agrees to our trade structures and sets all of our pay levels, agreed to a proposal that aligned trade structures, career models, training throughput and pay scales for our cyber specialists across the Navy, the Army and the Air Force. That was significant because it's the first time in the history of the Australian Defence Force that we've been able to actually make that alignment for like trades across the three services that comprise the Australian Defence Force. So I'm just creating holes elsewhere that the Chief of Navy, the Chief of Army and the Chief of Air Force need to manage, and they give me snotty looks every now and then. But I'm not worried about attracting people to the capability. We've designed a training throughput, a training pipeline, which will achieve the standards that we need. We have a CORE core skill in the ADF in taking someone and off the street, literally training them into something. It's what the military's always been very, very good at. But the next challenge, of course, will be retaining these highly trained, highly professional men and women who are in high demand, not only elsewhere in government, but within industry, and that's not just in Australia. That's across the globe, and so that's not quite costing me sleep yet, but it's something that that my team and I are spending a lot of time thinking about. That's probably enough.
Thanks, Marcus. John, if you could respond, and Marcus has obviously laid down his view on the structure and observations of scale and organisation and culture, etc., are important. But if you could talk to just what you think might be relevant lessons the US journey has had along this functional command stand up that a country the size and scale of Australia should be looking to, use best practice organisationally. And the thing that pops up into my mind that we should preserve, regardless of the differences in the two organisations, is the interoperability question. So, my input would be, if we can build something that's still able to talk, does it really matter? And if we're able to burden share, does it really matter if they're different organisationally?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. First, looking at the information warrior of the future, I'm glad you started with how do you do it and not why should we do it. My personal perspective is that the nature of warfare has forever changed, and these are skills that we need to deal effectively with national and international security into at least the near future. I think that, if you look at my personal journey from infantry to special operations to information warfare to cyber, I think it's my own reflection of my own recognition that we've been in a new environment requiring a new form of warfare for some time now. I don't think we're going to see any more traditional wars. I mean, the US hasn't declared war since World War II. Nobody wants to challenge the US or its allies conventionally. Too costly, they'll probably lose. And that's why, as we've talked about before, we see our adversaries moving into this realm of the gray zone and information warfare. So what kind of skills are required? I think what I've learned in my experience, there's two generic kinds of deeply trained skills. One is technical, one is human-based. And while they're separate, they are definitely linked in today's information age, where human decision-making and behavior are inextricably linked to the digital environment. The technical would cover cyber, and there are many categories just within cyber, like forensics, malware analysis, coding, software development, software engineers, data scientists, threat hunters. The list goes on, but that's just cyber. It's equally specialized within electronic warfare, space operations, the electromagnetic spectrum, et cetera. The human-based would cover psychological operations, civil affairs, deception, public affairs, social science, marketing. Yeah, the list continues to go on there. Those two categories, they have a lot of skill sets underneath those. And in today's environment, I think we need to be dynamic. We need to be flexible and adaptable. And I would encourage not setting too much in stone, as both human and tech environments will continue to change at scale and speed. And so will the threats in those interconnected environments. In the US Army, while deep training and experience in each of those individual skills is important, it's even more important that you know how to integrate them to achieve an overall, operational effects throughout the information environment, so that you can impact human decision-making and change human behavior. And that was the role in the US Army for the Functional Area 30 IO officer, and I was one of the first. But the US never prioritized the development of this community, and it ebbed and flowed. Ultimately it was viewed as either superfluous, you can get that from within the individual skills community or ineffective. And I always thought that, I thought of it through the lens of my combined arms experience that I explained earlier. But there was no land warfare specialist rating for thinking combined arms. Every branch was taught. So for information warfare, we created an integration specialist. And I always thought if we did it right, we'd get back to thinking combined arms in the information environment. And the FA30, the Functional Area 30 IO officer, would work him or herself out of a job if all branches could incorporate the same type of concept as thinking of traditional land warfare combined arms. In terms of, whether or not a cyber command is right for Australia, that's a determination only you can make for yourselves. And it's about what's right for you based on your goals and objectives, your threats, your form of government, your legal framework, and even your society. We don't actually have a separate cyber service like the Space Force, which is more of a Marine Corps model in its relationship to the US Navy. We have a separate Unified Combatant Command, the US Cyber Command, and it has service cyber components under its operational control. And by the way, each service cyber component reports to Cybercom as well as to its own service headquarters, which can be a source of friction. It also has separate joint cyber forces under its operational control. And it took a decade for the unified command to occur. And until recently, it was a sub-unified command under US Strategic Command. And there have been constant battles throughout its evolution over who had operational and tactical control over the service and the other, between the services and the other combatant commands. So to me, the real key is to determine how do you best elevate the stature and authority of your military cyber capabilities into a single, responsible, accountable organization with appropriate command, control, and oversight to ensure that cyber is truly a priority without everybody else wiping their hands of their own necessary roles in cyber. Because cyber is fundamentally a distributed environment, and every aspect of government, military, industry, and society plays a role in it. So for me, any organizational construct that doesn't account for the distributed nature of the environment is bound to fail because it takes teamwork and partnerships to be effective. And you can do that through organizational structure, you can do that through processes, or you can do it through both.
Thanks very much, John. We've blown right through my intention to have a more dynamic Q&A, and we do have a lot of good questions because the topic lends itself to 5 hours, not one. And it's been great to have you both here, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to wrap up. And I'd like to offer, if you could have a pithy couple of sentences for our audience who are very interested in this area to take away from this discussion. How should they view, what are the key points in terms of viewing the complexity and the journey that the nation needs to be on? Whenever the discussion of cyber information warfare, its relationship to what we are now recognizing as grey zone. In our recent strategy, Australia has clearly declared it wants to influence. So how best does everybody across industry, defence, etc., contribute to the influence, staying left of conflict, and how do some of the themes we've talked about tonight contribute to them being better aware of that journey and how we may approach it? Marcus, if you could lead off.
I'd say that this is the classic team sport, and from a national perspective, this capability is fundamentally joint, inextricably interagency, and indeed whole of nation. And we've got to find ways to bring all of that together. From a military perspective, we're still closer to the start of this journey than we are to the end. We will know we've succeeded when combat commanders think kinetic and non-kinetic effects in the same breath. We'll know we've succeeded when that's the case. We're not there yet from an ADF perspective. I will just say, Bill, that I'll just finish with just by presenting three questions that are constantly occupying my mind that I've shared with similar audiences over the past 12 months. How do we continue to have a sensible public discussion about these challenges? We need to. Secondly, how do we all work collectively, collaboratively to improve our national resilience in this space? And thirdly, as the Australian Defence Force guy, what's the role of the military here? There are sensible, strict, very strict, very sensible constitutional legal constraints for regarding the use of the military in a domestic setting, and I just wonder what that means in this domain. I'll finish there.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I just have a broader message for everyone. I've found in my experience, both military and in industry, the biggest threat we still have is ourselves as users of the IT environment. If people would just employ basic standards and discipline when they engage their devices, we would be able to stop, in my opinion, 80 to 90% of everything we're seeing today from cyber threats. So every digital citizen has a critical role to play in improving our current situation. And just a plug here, and I don't get any benefit from this, if you want to know what those details are that every responsible digital citizen can do, read a book called The Fifth Domain. It's written by Richard Clark, the former counterterrorism and cyber czar for both President Clinton and Bush, and Rob Kanaki, another former administration official. In that book, there's a role for government, there's a role for industry, which industry has an enormous role, and then there's a role for everybody. And there's some very clear, non-technical language for things that every responsible citizen can do.
Thanks very much, John and Marcus. I'm going to have to wrap it up here. If you could stay on the line, I'm just going to go through a few quick thank yous. To both of you, thank you very much for the conversation this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think critically important to Marcus's first point, sensible conversations, we need to have them. And we do appreciate USI, ACT for both of you giving your valuable time. And thank you very much. I know you're both true believers in this regard, so it hasn't been much of a sacrifice, but we really do appreciate your time tonight. John, you're obviously now doing great things out in industry, and we really appreciate Palo Alto Networks freeing up your time and you rising with the sparrows to talk with us from the Northern Hemisphere. Marcus, thanks again for all the great work you're doing in defence, and all the best in that journey. Our sponsor, PwC, thanks very much for sticking with us. Jeremy and Sarah did a lot of work putting this together, and hopefully this went out and we haven't been talking to ourselves for the last hour. If it's taped, then we may be able to resurrect it. And lastly, thanks to the membership, USI, ACT, for your patience with us. Hopefully this format has satisfied why you're sticking with us, and we hope to bring you more into the future. So again, John and Marcus, thanks. If you stay on the line, we'll unplug to the great world, and we'll finish up there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bill.